Good morning. Glad to be here. My title is Making Use of On-Farm Data. I'm really going to be talking about our variable rate study that's supported by the Canola Council of Canada in conjunction with producer organizations across the Western Prairies, Farming Smarter, Northeast Agricultural Research Foundation, and the Tobacco Creek Soil Water Management Association. So just an overview of my presentation. I'll be giving you a summary of my objectives for the project, some of the research questions that we're addressing in our project, a little bit of the background, some of the methodology, some previous research results to put everything in context and why I decided to go the direction I did in collaboration with these research groups, future directions, and finally a summary. So overall, we have a very specific experimental design and an overall specific objective, which is to assess management zones for variable rate application of nitrogen based on an analysis of 3 to 5 years of previous yield maps. And that can be any crop. It's not just canola. So we adjust the data for other crops such as flax or wheat or barley, peas, and we include those in our analysis. However, although the study is fairly simple in terms of that response of nitrogen fertilizer in these management zones, I'm also looking at a lot of other variables because it seems to me that there's a lot of potential to expand the scope and address the importance of other factors that influence the variability of crop yield in the landscape, and to use that data to further refine variable rate technology. So we've collected other data, and we'll be analyzing these further on as the project evolves, as we collect all our data from the various sites. In particular, RadarSat data and other sources of remote sensing data, and an analysis of the elevation data and calculating terrain attributes at the end of the study. Terrain attributes are things like slope and surface curvature and where the water collects in the field. So our objectives are to assess management zones, as I indicated, the complementary analysis and the zones. The research questions are fairly specific, and they're based on scientific methodology. Does variable rate management based on management zones derived from this analysis increase canola yield in areas with consistently high production and low variability? What is the economic return and efficiency of fertilizer use from variable rate management? So not only are we looking at the yield response to our fertilizer management, but we're also going to be assessing the economic return. And we have a template that we've shared with our collaborators. They record all of the inputs, all of the activities for the management at the field scale. So we'll attempt to look at the economic return of this particular management system. Other questions include the spatial and statistical variability of canola yield. Just how variable are those yields, and how are they related to the spatial distribution of soil test NNP at the field scale? Now, when I use the term soil test NNP, I'm referring to a wide range of soil testing methodologies, whether they're traditional soil lab analyses with extraction or with plant root simulators. They're all methods of soil test NNP. It's at the field scale, so we're working with producers in their fields. How is that variability related to current soil test recommendations? Can we add more information to current soil test recommendations for canola? I'm using current recommendations for hybrids that are used in Alberta and developed by Regas Caramanos. How well are digital elevation, landform, and remote sensing data correlated with canola yield? And when I raise this question, I want to emphasize that it's the combined information from all of these. I'm well aware that the industry is far ahead in using remote sensing data to develop consulting plans and variable rate management. I'd just like to see how the combined information from all of these sources relates to canola yield in field scale variability? Can the information from those questions be combined, as I mentioned, into improved methodology? A little bit of background, it's somewhat dated statistics, but AgVi's labs indicated that soil sampling in Manitoba doubled based on grid and management zones from 2005 to 2009 to approximately 45%. Statistics Canada reported in 2006 that 57% of farms in prairies use tracking or guidance systems, while 10% use the equipment for yield maps. In other words, the technology is here. The yield monitors, the global positioning systems, GIS software, remote sensing, the technology is here, but a lot of questions remain. How does it all work together? Does it really have an impact? Certainly, we've had some very successful consulting industries, and they've provided a service to producers. How is the technology used effectively? In other words, where in the field do the inputs grow? So simply put, the goal of variable management is to put the inputs in the areas where you're going to get the most return, to improve environmental sustainability. Now, as you all know, soil characteristics vary considerably in many fields and should be managed accordingly. In the past, producers have known their fields and were able to adjust their management. However, these days, the scale of farming has increased considerably, and producers are often renting land and certainly need more management tools to address those rented areas. Variable rate application, in my opinion, begins with the delineation of management zones within fields based on yield and also with respect to economic return. Now, there are quite a few different methods that have been assessed and tried in the past and are currently evolving. One was grid soil sampling that started in the 90s. However, it was certainly evident after a short while that it was fairly expensive in terms of soil testing and the whole process of collecting those soil test data. Landform analysis was another methodology where you look at the landform and stratify management based on landform, but that didn't provide all the answers either. Satellite images continue to be used by industry and certainly have been successful in the past. Soil conductivity is another source of information. Lewis talked yesterday about the project with Veris Technology, and certainly there's potential there in delineating areas of high and low productivity and the reason for that high and low productivity. Ground-based sensors are another technology. Green Seeker technology, for example, is a sensor that mounts on sprayers and allows for variable rate management of spraying of nitrogen solution in midway through the growing season to address deficiencies. And finally, yield maps, which is the approach that I'm taking in this particular study. And all of these lead to development of management zones. In other words, zones that are fairly uniform within that particular area and would respond uniformly to management. Basically, I've already reviewed the intensive soil test and the issues related to the cost of that. Landform analysis, just a little more detail. Often practitioners have divided the field into upper, middle, and lower slope positions based on digital elevation data, somewhat problematic in some cases if you don't have that expertise. The software certainly is becoming more and more available as time progresses. Satellite images such as Landsat have been used throughout Western Canada and certainly can be used to define areas of low and high production. And yield maps can be used in conjunction with these satellite images. Conductivity instruments such as the Veris have been used in the United States to delineate areas of high and low productivity, and in Canada to identify the areas particularly where there's high salinity that reduces yield. Now there's an interesting development in terms of unmanned aerial vehicles and the application of that to variable management. These unpiloted vehicles are commercially available, and I'm sure you've all seen them. The technology is rapidly advancing, and certainly there's considerable interest. There's a number of questions that remain in terms of GPS navigation, the actual use of the technology, and stitching all the sensor images together to get an accurate map of the field. The sensors have to be on these unpiloted vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles, should be evaluated with respect to the correlation with the factors, because many factors have similar effects on the crop canopy. For example, a nitrogen deficiency might be similar to water deficiency, soil moisture deficiency, or some sort of disease in terms of the reflectance of the crop and the sensor reading. So certainly the sensors need to be evaluated with respect to that. You have to differentiate between nutrient deficiency, plant disease, and insufficiency or excess soil moisture. Current sensors are based on a naturalized difference vegetation index, but new generations will probably use other wavelengths in addition to red and near infrared technology. Here's an example of an unpiloted unmanned aerial vehicle I saw in Sacramento this year. It's developed by Yamaha. It's over $200,000, and they use it to spray 1 acre at a 1 acre per application for disease and that type of thing. It's just an indication of the things to come. More commonly, you'll see an unmanned vehicle, unmanned aerial vehicle of this type has a digital camera or perhaps NDVI sensor on the bottom, and you can fly it over a field and identify areas where you've got issues, or we can identify where those issues exist with respect to an impact on yield of disease or weed competition. Now the sensors been assessed in current research and continue to be assessed in terms of the NDVI, which is a long history in crop research. And the Green Seeker also uses a variant of the NDVI as well as an equation to convert the information from the in-crop measurements to the requirement for fertilizer application and the split application. In the ground-based sensors, I believe there are other instruments as well, IARIS. They regulate the application of fertilizer by relating the sensor measurements to a fully fertilized strip in the field. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about new research in variable rate and the application of data mining methodology. As I mentioned, there's an awful lot of information available for fields, and one of the objectives of this particular project is to not only assess the fertilizer response in those management zones, but also to use these data mining technologies and methodologies and analysis of large data sets to see if we can improve our algorithms for variable rate management. These methods aren't entirely new in that they are used in a wide range of applications, from banking to genomics to medicine. They're commonly available now in various statistical programs used by scientists and researchers. Now here's an example of a study that I'm working on. It's a rotation study. It's not related to variable rate management, but it's a study of input diversity, and it's also it's a study of inputs, various levels, ranging from organic to a high input. So there's organic or very low inputs, and a medium level of inputs, and then a very high level of inputs of fertilizer and pesticides. And that's on the input side. On the diversity side, it ranges from rotations, 6-year rotations with annual grains, moving through another rotation with annual grains and oilseeds, and then finally annual grains and perennials. So I use these data mining techniques to look at the variability of the yield data in that particular study, and it split the data up. And interestingly enough, when you look at the 18-year period, the most important variable appears to be a growing season precipitation. And that's a fairly important factor, and I guess you're all very well aware of that. It was mentioned yesterday in a presentation about the importance of precipitation and Liebig's law. But it's an interesting analysis in that it identifies cutoff levels and various precipitation levels in various months of the growing season, and also gives us another tool to take that variability and use that variability in the analysis of the yield response to our input treatments and to our diversity treatments. The data mining analysis of the Scott study that I talked about, and we're writing up a number of papers on this study. It's quite an informative study. Not only have we looked at growing season precipitation during the 18 years of the study, but we've also identified variability within the field site, which we're also analyzing in terms of these terrain attributes that I just referred to, and also the distribution of soil texture through the plot area. So I think we're going to be able to further refine our analysis of the input levels and of the diversity levels in that particular study. So I've talked a lot about the management zones and the emphasis on combining information from several sources. The multi-year analysis of yield maps is crucial to this analysis. In other words, identifying where you have consistently high production and consistently low production. The use of new satellite data such as RadarSat-2, it's a C-band on that particular satellite, to look at the distribution of soil moisture in the spring, another tool that could be used in variable rate management, and analysis of landforms. And finally, soil test analysis and optical sensors. Variables of interest, as I mentioned, are the management zones, fertilizer rates, NPK&S, landform, spring soil moisture, soil association and series. We have a fairly good database of soil associations and series throughout Western Canada. We should make use of those. Soil pH, texture, and conductivity are also being measured in our study, as well as we're assessing crop disease and pests. We're measuring emergence, determining seeding rates, precipitation, and growing degree days. So all of this information is being drawn together to analyze the results of the studies. Here's an example of a study that I conducted at the Manitoba Zero Tillage Research Association in Brandon. These are data for 2012, and in this particular analysis, the zones, the low and the average zones were categorized in one category, whereas the high zone was in a second category with higher production. And then when you move on to the landform analysis, within the low and average zones, there's a further differentiation in terms of landform and the impact on yield within the management zone, the low and average management zones. Now, as you're all well aware, there's a lot of potential variability, and those include the yield averages measured in the zones, yield map accuracy, yield and position outliers, alignment of GPS points along the harvest paths, the recalculation of yield position to minimize effects of grain residence time within the combine. It's important to normalize the crops, in other words, put all the different crops in the analysis on the same basis in terms of comparing wheat to canola to flax to peas. And furthermore, there are other sources of variability such as various combines and certainly calibration. In our studies at the Zero Till farm, we used a weigh wagon to calibrate the combines, and when the weigh wagon wasn't available, we used a commercial scale. In the study at Zero Till, the producers there identified variable management of fertilizer N as their highest priority for research at the site. And so we initiated that study from 2008 to 2013. As I described previously, we defined the management zones based on 5 years of yield maps that have been collected previous to the study up till 2008. In our particular study with the Canola Council, we've had to adjust our expectations because we found that it's very difficult to find a producer who has 5 years of good yield data. So we've been using 3 years of data. At the zero-till farm, we normalized the data into those high, average, and low yield zones. And then we applied fertilizer treatments, including a control with 0 N rates. PK and S were applied at sufficient levels for the crop. We also applied at 50% of soil test recommendation, 100% and 150% of soil test recommendation. This is an example of one of our fields. This is the analysis over 5 years of data, and you can see the areas where we have low yield. Those are the red areas. Average and high yield are the green areas. This particular area here happens to be a study that was conducted previously, so we didn't have yield data collected for that area, and that's why it shows up as red. This is how we set up our treatments, and you can see our treatments with the controls in red and our higher rates with the green. So we had 3 replicated blocks of those 4 treatments across the zones in this particular field. And these are the results for 2009 for canola production. There's a general trend where in the high production zone at 150% of soil test recommendation, we got high yields. And here's the control on the far side there. The controls are all 0, low 0, average 0, and high 0. So certainly there's a definite trend where no fertilizer applied to the high rates of fertilizer in the high producing area. Statistically, however, they're not statistically different. We need more data. So we conducted the study over several years. These are the results of the research in 2012, and we had a very similar trend, again with the controls on your right, with the low production in the areas where no fertilizer was applied. However, there was a bit of an outlier, the average 150 there. Well, on the left, you can see that we had the highest production in the area with traditionally high production as determined with the yield maps and 150% of N. So in summary, there appears to be a response, but we needed more data, and that's the reason why we decided to initiate this study with the Canola Council. It's a variable rate study with multiple sites in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Same design, although we're adding a lot more information to the analysis. We have collaborators of Farming Smarter, also the Northeast Agricultural Research Foundation, and Deerwood Soil and Water Management. We plan to have 13 fields next year. We have AgMet stations at each of the sites. And we are applying the fertilizer using the producer's equipment. In some cases, this has resulted in some problems. The producer's equipment is not designed to apply the highest rates that we plan, so we've applied as high as we can. And in some cases, the end source is a bit low, and that affected the rates of fertilizer that we could apply. Here's an example of a site at Kevinock's land, and this is the analysis of the multi-year average. The red areas are the low-yielding areas, green are the high. We set up our treatments across those zones with the various fertilizer rates that I described. And here's our as-applied map on Kevinock's land there in Manitoba. We had a site at HB Farms. Here's the analysis of the multi-year site. Here's our as-applied map. All these maps were developed in SMS, an Ag Leader program. Unfortunately, we had an equipment malfunction on HB Farms, recording the rates as applied. The data that we do have indicates that we did apply what we planned on. However, one of my collaborators had a UAV which he flew over the site, and it's hard to see in this particular image, but if If you look at it, you can certainly see that this particular control certainly is distinct from the adjacent treatment. So that was a good application of the UAV in terms of just confirming some of our applications and identifying the variability in the field. This study is designed to assess a wide variety of factors that affect yield, and certainly we'll be looking at a number of variables, including those meteorological variables, NNP fertility, landform variability of yield, and the remote sensing data. So we plan to assess the variable rate technology and implement these analyses of all these data combined. Producers are certainly interested in these advanced methodologies, and the project funded by AAFC and the Canola Council will go till 2017 to provide this information. And I just want to reemphasize that we'll be collecting economic data for the project, and Dr. Mohamed Kakwazan at the Brandon Research Center will be looking at those data. I'd like to thank Mohamed for participating in the project. Aaron Glenn is the ag meteorologist collaborating on the project. Andrew Kupicek is my technician. Nicole Rabe and Lindsay Coulthart worked on the previous study at the Manitoba Zero Tillage Research Association. Régent Picard is working with the unmanned aerial vehicles, and the Canola Council staff has certainly been supportive, as have AAFC and the Canola Council funding. So going forward too, I'm a bit over time, I apologize. But if you have any questions, please contact me. I'll be here till noon, and thank you very much for your interest.